I'm the spokeswoman for Save Women's Sports Australasia, and we recently founded this group, the Australian version, because of some guidelines that were announced last year by our Australian Human Rights Commission and Sports Australia. And with those guidelines, they basically announced, they were called the Trans and Gender Inclusion Guidelines for Sports. And it basically means that males can self-declare a female identity when they register for the sport, and then they can play in the women's teams. It also means that they can go into the change rooms, toilets, and overnight accommodation of their choice. And if any parent or female competitor raises an issue, it will be that competitor who will be excluded and sanctioned. So this happened about a year and a half ago. Then what happened was, just recently, is a group called Pride in Sport, which is affiliated with a charity called ACON, which was originally founded back in the 80s when the AIDS crisis happened. Now, obviously, that is no longer a crisis here in Australia, so they needed to rebrand themselves and expand their purpose. So they moved into trans and gender advocacy. And a part of that is this Pride in Sports group. So the Pride in Sports groups is now going and approaching all the different sporting organisations in Australia and getting them to sign up to the trans and gender inclusion guidelines within their own sporting codes. So this was announced a couple of weeks ago with 8 different sports signing up to this. So AFL, which might be familiar to some of you because Hannah Mounsey plays AFL, which is a very fast-paced, high-impact sport. So he's a born male who's a very large individual who also plays handball. And then hockey, netball, rugby, tennis, touch football, the university sporting codes and water polo were all signed up to this. Now, Pride in Sports is now going to systematically work their way through every single sporting code in Australia and have them implement these guidelines. So when that happened a few weeks ago, that's where I stepped in. I don't have a sports background myself, but I have 3 little girls who between them played 3 different sports. So I felt it was really necessary to have a voice within Australia to criticise these guidelines. And that's when we joined forces with Save Women's Sports New Zealand, who were already established, and they came out of the Speak Up for NZ Women organisation. So we decided to join forces and fight this together because Australia is somewhat the canary in the coal mine for New Zealand. They haven't implemented their guidelines as yet. But as you can see, Australia, the sports have pretty much already fallen to this ideology. Now, the interesting thing about that in Australia is in 1984, we implemented our Sex Discrimination Act, and that was for the purpose of incorporating the UN CEDAW Convention into our legislation. So that occurred all the way back in 1984. But then in 2013, we had some provisions inserted into the Sex Discrimination Act, which was effectively gender identity protection provisions. And the definition for gender identity was taken from the Yogyakarta Principles. So that was inserted into the Act, and that was done without any media scrutiny, any wide public consultation, and so on. So this all sort of happened by stealth. Now, I have a legal background, so I argue that in inserting the gender identity provisions, it's actually contrary to the sex discrimination provisions that already existed. We also have a provision in the Act that allows us to exclude males on the basis of sex in relation to sport, where strength, stamina or physique are relevant. So I think we can all argue that those 3 metrics are relevant to pretty much every single sport except maybe, say, darts or equestrian. However, in interpreting the legislation, the Pride in Sports have completely ignored that provision and the protections that exist for women. And also, I would urge any woman who is interested in this area to actually go and read CEDAW, because the articles in CEDAW provide enormous protection to women, and there's 189 countries globally that have ratified the convention. So for us here in Australia, because we put it in our legislation, it actually means that it's federal law. And there are provisions in relation to sports, Article 10, Section G. But when they implemented the guidelines with Pride in Sports, they've completely ignored these existing protections. So they've focused on the gender identity provision, which is a very narrow interpretation, instead of looking at these other protections. So that's our argument, that we have a private charity that is promulgating this public policy that affects 50% of the Australian population, and there's been no proper democratic process, there's been no parliamentary oversight, no media scrutiny. So it's gone outside our normal democratic process. I would also add that the Fourth Estate is completely ignoring this in Australia. We have one journalist who's covering it in a very conservative newspaper behind a paywall, but effectively the debate isn't really happening in Australia at all. So we're trying very hard to raise awareness that this is happening, because obviously the general public are only getting one side of the story from Pride in Sports. So, and Pride in Sports operates under the principle that we're all familiar with, the principle of inclusion. And they have stated that they look at that principle of inclusion as the paramount consideration for sports in Australia. Now, obviously, when you look at the IOC, the paramount principle is fair competition. So we're asking the question, so who gave them the authority to change all of this without consulting with women? So we are raising our profile gradually in Australia, and we have a wonderful legislative champion, Claire Chandler, who's a federal senator, who is asking some hard questions on our behalf. And she has dragged into Senate committee Sport Australia and the Australian Human Rights Commission, who first put out the sports guidelines, to ask them what was their rationale, where was their authority, who did they consult with. We've had other women's groups put in FOIs on the consultation process, and they've admitted that they consulted with 100 groups. Only one of them was a women's group, and they will not disclose what the other groups are, which is highly unusual practice, particularly when you're being questioned by a senator in federal committee. So Claire has been asking some hard questions, and Sports Australia has just, they won't define what a woman is. They keep saying, well, we did this to interpret, we put the guidelines out as an interpretation of the legislation, when in actual fact, they haven't interpreted it correctly or fairly at all. And Claire has actually written about this in an op-ed in a newspaper. And because of that op-ed, she's actually been dragged in front of the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal down in Tasmania. Someone made a complaint, and the senator was dragged into the tribunal to answer for what she said, which was basically women's sports change room toilets should remain female only. And the tribunal wanted her to sign a confidentiality clause in relation to the hearing, and she refused to do that. And she made it very clear that she would be fighting this. And it was at that time that the male person who brought the complaint, who actually isn't even part of the trans community, decided to withdraw it. But it is deeply sinister that we can have a federal parliamentarian dragged in front of an anti-discrimination tribunal that's not part of the judicial, that's outside of the judicial process, to answer for having an opinion that the vast majority of people agree with. Like here in Australia, we have a concept that we call the pub test. So if you go to the local pub or the local bar, if you ask people in there, what do they think? We all know that the vast majority of people are on side with retaining the integrity of women's sports. But unfortunately here in Australia, we have this organisation, Pride in Sports, which receives $12 million annually from our state health department, which I think is, it comes from the original funding when they were serving the purpose of fighting the AIDS crisis, but they are now using those funds to promulgate these guidelines that are so harmful to women's inclusion in sports. In Australia and New Zealand, in relation to COVID, obviously we've had, sports has been greatly affected, and the funding and so on. Now, when all of that happened, there were discussions about restarting the competitions, and that, unfortunately, in Australia and New Zealand was focusing exclusively on males. There was very little discussion about getting the women's codes up and running again. And we actually had a quote from the Warriors, which is the New Zealand rugby. The CEO said that he regarded women as an additional spend. So in Australia and New Zealand, we're still up against women's sports not having access to adequate resource. And then now they're turning around and decimating us by allowing males to compete in our sports. Another example of this that happened that was really quite egregious was when Cricket Australia brought out their guidelines. They were the first sporting code to do so. And at the time, they brought out a spokesperson, person who went by the name of Erica James, who's a middle-aged biological male, who was discussing how he was very excited to be joining the University of Sydney women's cricket team. Now, the same week that Cricket Australia was announcing all these guidelines, they also announced that they were bringing in pay parity for women's cricket. So the same week that they did that, they also opened up women's cricket to male competitors. So I think the irony won't escape most of us in that regard. But here in Australia, we're trying really hard to get awareness around Save Women's Sports Australasia. So like Linda said, and some of the other women have said, is there is a lot that you can do. You can write to your MPs, write to your newspaper outlets, tweet, send emails, send snail mail, just try and raise awareness. Write to your sporting organisations, say that you disagree with it. The more voices that we have out there, the better. And obviously here in Australia, you can have a meeting with your Member of Parliament that has to remain confidential. So try, give them a phone call, see if you can have a meeting with them, see if you can raise your issues so that they know that people are watching and they know that we disagree with what is happening. Wanted to reiterate the CEDAW point and really urge all women to track down a copy and read it, because with the 189 countries that have ratified it, they need to be upholding what that convention says. Yeah. So we do have protections, and our government should be taking steps to protect women. And if they're ignoring them, like with Australia specifically with this sports provision, they're going counter to their international treaty obligations, and they're going counter to their statutory obligations. So we are entitled to stand up and ask questions, to ask our journalists to ask questions, for our parliaments to answer us as to why they're dismissing our needs in favour of this ideology. And I mean, what we've got here is we've got women's material reality, the biological nature of our sex bodies, and it's coming up against this gender ideology, which is based on ideas and feelings and, a definition that comes from the Yogyakarta principles that effectively means that when you look at the actual definition, it's circular and it's based on stereotypes and mannerisms and things like that. And when you look at CEDAW actually says that we should not be discriminating against women on the basis of sex stereotypes. But then they look at the gender identity definition, and that is based on stereotypes. So we have this inherent conflict between what we're arguing and what the gender ideology people are arguing. But, we've got the reality of our bodies, we've got science, we've got most of the world agreeing with what we say. So we need everyone to just try and get out there, have conversations with your neighbours, with your families, be brave, let them know what you think, get those conversations happening. And that's, as Beth said, it's going to be a grassroots movement. It will probably require some action throughout the courts, but I think that we have basis to bring actions when we have some female athletes brave enough to step up and when we get some funding. But I do think it's possible to turn this around.